The ancient history of the Indian subcontinent is still somewhat unclear and remains controversial. There's a standard story, which you can find in most textbooks, of the theory of the Aryan invasion. If you look at Pakistan here, modern-day Pakistan, which of course is part of kind of greater historical Indian area, notice this river running through it. That's the Indus River. Along that river was what archaeologists call the Indus Valley Civilization. And the standard story is that it was thriving around the year 2500 BCE. And then sometime within the year range 2500 to 1500 BCE, the Aryans invaded. This is the name these people called themselves. It seems to have meant noblemen or landlords or something like that. And they were originally from somewhere to the northwest here. And the theory is that these Aryans invaded and took over the Indus Valley civilization and eventually pushed all the way into India and sort of Aryanized the culture and the religion and combined with whatever people were already there. The Aryans do seem to have had their own pantheon, their own religious traditions, which is similar to the religious traditions of ancient Persia, that is modern-day Iran, and other cultures in that area. Sometimes scholars call this Vedic religion, believing that the Hindu scriptures called the Vedas were written during this period. Some scholars are skeptical about this standard story, and some have argued that the archaeology of the last 3 decades or so has called some elements of this into question. Some scholars now theorize that when it comes to the demise of the Indus Valley civilization, that it wasn't that they were invaded and crushed by some outside force, the Aryans, but rather there was some sort of ecological disaster. Some say there's evidence that around 1700 BCE, there was an ecological change and one river dried up and the other one changed course. And then this civilization just wasn't viable because it was built on the river and it used the river for everything. As to the religion of the Indus Valley civilization, it's unclear how different it was from later Hinduism. They haven't found any temples so far in their excavations, which is interesting, because temples are a really important part of fully developed Hinduism. They have found some little figures that they think are possible precursors to the god Shiva, one of the high gods in Hindu tradition, who we'll talk about. That is in the artifacts of the Indus Valley civilization. And they have found some possible evidence of goddess worship, which is fairly widespread in Hindu tradition. They also have found some evidence possibly of sati, which we'll talk about in the next segment of this lecture. The problem is that the written language of the Indus Valley civilization has not been decoded. No one can read it. They found a lot of examples of it, but it's all a mystery to us right now. They think it's probably not an Indo-European language, but someday I predict somebody will be a big scholarly hero and actually decode that language, and then we'll know a lot more about this interesting civilization. When you step back and look at the big picture, and skeptics in both the West and in India have pointed this out, the archaeological evidence between 1700 BCE and 700 CE is surprisingly scant. There isn't a lot of evidence there. There isn't as much as we would like. Scholar Irving Hexham, who is one of these skeptics, observes that, quote, gradually a homogeneous culture seems to emerge by AD 700 CE, that is clearly Hindu. So what he's saying is that if you're going to be skeptical, if you're going to be the most conservative and the most dubious about claims about how ancient Hinduism is, you still would have to admit that there clearly is something that should be called Hinduism by 700 CE, and possibly earlier than that. But he's just skeptical for lack of evidence. As to the invasion, I believe there isn't evidence of any big series of battles, of cities being suddenly destroyed in war and so on that you might expect to find. Some theorize that there was a gradual migration and movement of people from the northwest down into the Indian subcontinent, those Aryans. But they say it wasn't necessarily an invasion. Irving Hexham makes an interesting analogy to what you could call the 20th century flood of immigrants into Europe from the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. In the 19th century, most people who lived in Europe were ethnically Europeans. By the end of the 20th century, as Hexham says, you have many millions of people from Africa, the Middle East, and Asia now living in Europe. Some future historian, even some archaeologist, 10,000 years from now might look back and say, wow, there was an invasion of Europe by these superior Asians and Africans. And they would note that there was a sudden change, from their perspective, a sudden change in the inhabitants of Europe in the 20th century. Well, there has been kind of a sudden change, but it's not an invasion, it's a migration. Which of these theories is true, the traditional story or the revived story? I really don't know. I do think it is a little bit unsettling that some people claim that Hinduism is something that existed in 3000 BC or 2000 BC when we don't find any temples in that period, and there isn't evidence of gods like Vishnu and Krishna being worshipped for some of that period. I think what turns out to be true is going to depend on future discoveries in archaeology. We should always remember that just because a story appears in all the introductory textbooks does not mean there is strong evidence for it. What's really striking about Hinduism, especially if you're coming from the standpoint of Christianity or Islam, is the broad and vague character of this tradition. We can't, for instance, point to someone like Jesus or the Prophet Muhammad and say, this is the person that started it. When it comes to the Hindu tradition, there just is no founder. You just have to trace back sort of different traditions worshiping different deities, and you can sort of see how far back some of them go, but it's not usually a precise point in history they go back to. In the Hindu tradition, there isn't anything like the Ten Commandments. There are no divine commands binding on all people. Your religious duties are going to vary quite a bit depending on what your varna is, as we'll talk about shortly. There's no official creed of Hinduism. You can't just print something out on one side of one page that says, look, here's the 7 pillars of Hinduism or the 10 essential beliefs of Hinduism. There just isn't anything like that. And Hindus vary quite a bit in their religious beliefs, and quite a bit even in those core religious beliefs of the diagnosis and cure, although there is some commonality that we'll talk about. And because it doesn't have an official single creed, the Hindu tradition contains people that Western scholars would call monotheists, but also polytheists, atheists, pantheists, agnostics, and so on. Still, there is some unity, there's some commonality between the many strands of Hinduism, in particular belief in an ultimate called Brahman, which we'll talk about. That's more in philosophy than at the level of popular belief. In our next segment, we'll look at the interesting and controversial issue of caste and classical Hindu social structure.